I'm Phil Small. I'm a soil scientist, and I know about how to make biochar, how to use it, how to distinguish charcoal and ash, and how to make good quality biochar. And so this is March 4th in 2017. We're at the Flathead Valley Community College. And this room was open, and the video was available, so I thought I'd give it a try and see how we are at producing a biochar video. So I became interested in biochar in 2005 on reading a book, 1491 by Charles Mann. And this book was about what North and South America were like pre-Columbian. The book's title is 1491. And towards the end of the book, he talks about how there was a lot of people supported in the Amazon, millions of people. And as a soil scientist, I was trained to view the Amazon jungle as a wild land of very poor soils, could not support a large population. And so this idea that there could be a lot of people there kind of runs counter to how people understand how the Amazon works. And the reason that they were able to support a lot of people, the clue was in the black soils of the Amazon. And these soils are highly productive. They're recognized throughout history. During our Civil War, United States Civil War, when people left the United States to find a different place to grow cotton and still be able to have their slave economy, they found these very dark productive soils in the Amazon basin. And later, when Henry Ford was looking for land to grow trees for rubber, for his rubber tires, he found these black soils. Nobody really asked where these soils came from, which is what I'm interested in as a soil scientist, but they identified vast areas of them, very highly productive soils. So that ran counter to the understanding of how the soils work in the Amazon. And there actually is an eyewitness account for a very large population in the Amazon. I'm sorry, I don't recall the explorer's name, but he was part of an expedition up into the Andes and was sent down to lower elevations to forage and couldn't make it back up to his group because it was just too treacherous to get back up. Figured it was only a short way back to the Atlantic Ocean. And so he went down to the Amazon and floated out. It turned out to be a lot farther than what he anticipated. But during part of that journey, he recounts in his journals how he was attacked by a vast quantity of warriors and that there was buildings on both sides of the Amazon River, a city on both sides, and that this army was so well supported that they even had musical accompaniment while they harassed this party for days. 40 years later, they went back and looked for the civilization, and there was nothing there. This was the beginning of the legend of the 7 cities of gold. And people just chalked it up to him trying to feather his own reputation, trying to make himself more important than he actually was. And it was dismissed that there were those people. When we discovered these soils, an area almost as large as the size of France within the Amazon basin of darkened soils, darkened by charcoal, it really got a small group of soil scientists very interested in what this might mean. Analyzing the soil, they could see it had a lot of charcoal in it. And this was the beginning of the interest in something we're calling today biochar, which is charcoal that's made with the intent of using it to revitalize soils. How those worked in the Amazon. The Amazon is a very old, very weathered soil, high clay content, low nutrient capacity. The charcoal enhanced soils have got a lot of phosphorus in them, retained from the fish and food that these folks were eating. And those soils, the charcoal has somehow allowed those soils to retain that phosphorus. And the other interesting thing is that these soils have got a different soil biology in them that they're supporting. These soils are still productive hundreds of years later. and to the point where these are the soils that are sought after by the cities when they're trying to find soil for landscaping around their high-class hotels and places like that. They will dig the soil up, sell it, and move it to these places. That, for a number of years, the soil science community felt that this was unique to the Amazon, that it really didn't apply to anything but highly weathered tropical soils. But here in the United States, we realized that our plain soils, the tall grass prairies, very black soils, with an observed history of having been burned frequently, that these soils are also very high in charcoal. When I went to school to get my degree in soils in the 1970s, I was taught not to expect charcoal in soils. We were taught that those black colors were due to the root actions, the root exudates, and the massive amount of root production in a healthy grass ecosystem, and that these are what darken the soils through a process called melanization. Now that we have the analytical capabilities to distinguish charcoal and pyrolytic carbon in soils, we now see that many of these soils, the organic carbon content, over half of that is fire-derived, that these soils are the color of charcoal because they have quite a bit of charcoal in them. That they're highly productive. We've always thought of our prairies in North America as being this incredible soil resource because of the grass prairies. In actuality, this is a fire-derived landscape. These rich soils that has made our nation so great is due to Neolithic burning practices, tens of thousands of years of people advancing with fire sticks, burning the environment, whether to manage the natural environment in various ways. This is a gift. Our black soils are a gift from past civilizations. And we only put this together because we observed the burning when pioneers came into the Midwest, where soil science started 200 years ago in the Ukraine with the same very black soils, tall grass prairie. By the time that Vasily Dukachev started looking at what are the natural reasons we have different soils in different areas, the memory of that burning was lost. But those soils are also highly laden in charcoal. And those soils, those black soils, stretch from the Ukraine all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So this is something that is of great interest to the soil science community, but not something that we're actually doing any extensive research on. Research in agriculture and in soils is driven by commercial interests, by government interests, and we don't really have an interest in understanding charcoal and soils. So the mythology that soils cannot accumulate charcoal, that when fire burns it leaves only ash, that mythology is still in place with the soil science profession, and it's going to stay that way for decades without a doubt. But for those of us who are interested to the degree that we're trying to reproduce some of these results, we have learned quite a bit in the 12 years since I first became interested in biochar. And so I'm here today to tell you how to make charcoal, how to use the ash component, how to manage that, how to make good charcoal, and how to make it without polluting the air with lots of smoke. So charcoal, what is it? It is what's left when you burn a fuel and you heat distill all the volatiles off that can be heat distilled. So we heat up the fuel to the point where wood gas would volatilize off. That's a flammable gas, and we're left with a carbon matrix. And so the trick in making charcoal in a way that does not pollute the air unnecessarily is to burn all that smoke. We do not, the traditional way of making charcoal was to generate large quantities of smoke. Build a fire, have it covered up with soil, and just have this vast quantity of smoke coming out. And in fact, in 2009, when I made charcoal, I took 2 cords of wood, put it into an FAO ring kiln, which is made for producing charcoal in third world countries. We produced such a huge plume of smoke with that approach, and it was a mile off of I-90, and people on I-90 were calling the sheriff, calling in the fire department. They thought a very large fire was happening, that is definitely the wrong way to make charcoal. Although I got a vast quantity of high quality charcoal out of it, that's the wrong way to do it. In a vessel is not necessary. So now roll a few years forward, and we find that you can make clean, high quality charcoal without any smoke by using the approach that they use in Hawaii to make a bed of embers for a luau. And that is that you have a 45-degree, 50-degree angle pit, or the Japanese use a cone kiln, which is a metal pan like a wok, to do the same thing. You build a fire in the bottom and then you feed it. When you start losing the embers, the embers start turning to coal or to ash, then you feed it and you keep new fuel on top of it until you just build up a bed of embers. And you don't lose the embers in the bottom because the flames on top pull all the oxygen into the flame instead of it being directed at the charcoal and turning it into ash. So this is a new, relatively new development that surprises a lot of people involved with biochar, and that is that we don't need a vessel. We don't have to do it inside a gasifier or some sort of retort, although those are certainly good ways to make charcoal also. The charcoal that we make this way, there's two basic forms of charcoal, and one is a cold charcoal which never glows as an ember, and that stays in a form that we call amorphous, where the carbon structure is disorganized, amorphous, kind of like a glass, not crystalline. But once charcoal glows, starts glowing that dull red up to a bright white heat, that is, at that point, the charcoal reformulates into graphene sheets. At very high temperature, it will reform into graphite, and but it's the graphene sheets that's the majority of it. And these are two really physically and chemically different materials, and both occur in nature, and both are valuable to soils. And the amorphous form is a really excellent insulator. Heat has trouble going through it. It breaks down more easily than the crystalline form. And part of the property of being a good insulator is that if you're trying to make charcoal, you really don't want to make it out of large logs, because that amorphous carbon forms on the outside and starts penetrating towards the center. Well, that's keeping the heat from penetrating to the center of your log or piece of fuel. So we want, this kind of means that we make our best charcoal with wrist size wood and in slash piles, and definitely not huge logs, whole log. People have made whole log charcoal makers, and they're inefficient because of the insulating properties. The graphene, the turbostratic graphene, which is the first form, it forms these curved graphene surfaces. Those are really good. Graphene's a really good conductor of electricity, really good conductor of heat, unlike the amorphous. And we need that form in the soil also. And I have, getting deeply into the science part of it, probably deeper than is easy to explain, but electrical conductivity in soils is important to soil health. It's important to soil respiration in particular, because those parts of soil health, breaking down organic matter, plants photosynthesize and inject carbohydrates into the soil through their roots to support the healthy parts of the soil, the biology. That all involves breaking down the carbohydrates and turning it back into oxygen or turning it back into carbon dioxide and water. When that happens in the absence of oxygen, which is, the soil is full of carbon dioxide, not a lot of oxygen available for some of this, that releases an electron for each carbohydrate that's broken. And those electrons build up in the soil, and we measure that. That's a redox gradient. And you get a lot of respiration and not fast transfer of this gradient out. We get wetland conditions. This is what makes anaerobic conditions is what makes a compost pile stinky. It's what makes septic systems fail. And it is what we delineate when we delineate wetlands. We're delineating a change in the chemistry induced by high rates of respiration. And that may sound like just way more information than anybody needs, but the fact is that there's something about charcoal that it provides uniquely to soil that you don't get in any other place, and it affects how soils interact with the environment and with the plants. The other important thing to know is that all soils have charcoal. Charcoal does not break down very quickly, and charcoal has been a component of soils for 400 million years. As long as there's been plants and there's been lightning and there's been oxygen, charcoal is being produced, goes into soil, and that is 400 million years of evolution for plants and soil biology to evolve in the presence of charcoal. We have coal veins that are 100% charcoal because in a high oxygen environment, things burn very easily, but they don't burn to ash because it takes a higher level of heat to maintain coals glowing at an incandescent temperature than it does to evolve off the wood smoke and burn that. And that's why after a prairie fire, the prairies are black because the charcoal is retained. So that means that all soils, all healthy soils, are going to have a component of charcoal in them. Contrast that with what we teach our soil scientists today, and that is don't look for charcoal in the soil. If you do see charcoal in the soil, that is a man-made imposition on the soil. We study soils in a natural environment, so you should move over in describing your pit. I'm a soil classifier, so I describe soil pits. We have a mindset of not expecting charcoal. And as a result, this has caught our intellectual blind side. We don't understand how charcoal works in soils. We don't have research approaches to really isolate why it works. But if you look at what happens when you do introduce charcoal to soil, over a period of years, the soil becomes more healthy, the soil becomes more productive. Plants respond to the presence of fresh charcoal by growing much more expansive root systems. The stems get thicker. They are more able to shake off disease and issues with nutrient imbalances. These are things that when we notice these kinds of positive reactions in soils, we always attributed it to the ash component, that the fire releases nutrients that become available to the plants. We never really looked for the charcoal. So now we are looking for the charcoal, and we anticipate good things. But we're not really sure how to research it and communicate it. But I can tell you that at some point we are going to understand that a lot better. But in the meantime, today, we can make charcoal fairly easily. We can use it in our gardens. We can use it in a number of various ways. So first thing I want to do at this point is make sure that everybody understands how to make a clean burning fire and produce charcoal. It's going to be a combination of charcoal and ash, and then after that I'll tell you what to do with that material. So the trick of having a campfire, an open fire that you would produce charcoal in, is first to protect it from the wind, because the wind, when it gets into your fuel, it makes it burn much more intensely, of course, and it's much more difficult to hold the embers, and you produce a lot of ash. So you have to build the fire in a way that it's protected. The other day, I made charcoal at a 12-mile-per-hour wind on the ground, which I hadn't done before, and I did that by piling the fuel up on the windward side so that once the air blew into the fuel protected the fire, banked it, and the heat radiating into that fuel produced the wood smoke that then enveloped the fire, and that's what was burning. So you put your fuel upwind, you put something upwind to block the fire. You light the fire at the top of the pile. You always make sure that there's flame at the top of your fuel pile, your slash pile, whatever, because then the smoke produced from below gets pulled up into the flame, and then that smoke burns and radiates all the heat. If you have smoke escaping your fire, it means that you're losing an opportunity to generate the heat that can heat distill your fuel into charcoal. And getting the fuel to burn correctly, you really have to adjust your fuel to air ratio within the pile that you're doing. And whether you do a pre-built slash pile that you're top lighting, or whether you build a small fire and you build it up over time like a luau pit of embers, the principles are still the same, but you're trying to keep enough flame, you're trying to generate enough wood smoke to keep a good flame going so that the oxygen is pulled away from the embers. Then once you have a pile of embers, you have several ways to hold the embers and hold the charcoal. You're waiting for the point where you're not able to generate any more wood smoke. The flames have really died down to just a small flicker of wood smoke.
Fire is in our blood.
When that happens, you know you've exhausted your wood gas generation potential. And so now you hold the embers either by putting snow on it if you're doing a slash, you're doing fuel reduction at this time of the year, or you put water on it. You cover it with a blanket of soil, which is what they do for luau pits.
And in that
or you
process,
cover it with a metal
our
cover or
bodies and our
something that keeps
minds changed.
the
Our
air out.
intestines became shorter, our jaws became less
And that's how you hold
powerful.
the
We
charcoal.
could support the larger brain.
There's other ways, of course,
10
that
to
people know
20%
how to make
of our
charcoal, and that's
metabolic
inside a
energy
vessel.
Because of fire. I mean,
The
fire
definition
is
of biochar
So
that a lot of
giving
people
that,
use
giving
is
that
that
fire
it's fuel burned
responsibility to somebody
in
else
the absence of
really
oxygen,
doesn't make
and
sense
that
when
implies
we
that you
consume
need
that.
to actively
It's
keep
not
it out
our
with a
lives
metal
for
vessel
making
or a
charcoal.
ceramic vessel or something like that.
Charcoal.
But the principle for an open
That's all I
flame
can think of right now.
is still the
I
same.
had some
You're
questions.
still keeping the oxygen out. If you do it in a vessel, there are two ways to do it. One is a retort, and the other is a gasifier. And a retort is a vessel filled with fuel that you
The
heat
question
from the
is,
outside.
what,
And so no
what kind of
oxygen can
guidelines
get
do we
in,
have
but
to
there's
know how
usually
much
enough of a
charcoal
hole
to put
in it that wood smoke, which expands greatly,
I am
can
a
push
big
its way
believer in
out,
small
and so you have a
increments
stream
every
of wood
year
smoke
rather
coming
than
out
one large
of a
amount
hole
at a
or
time.
out of
If you
some
were to do
exhaust
one
port.
large amount at a time,
This is how you
certainly
make
would
char
not
cloth.
exceed
If you do
10%
flint and
of the
steel,
volume
and you're starting a fire with flint and steel,
And the
you
reason for that
knock
is
the
that
spark
a soil
into
is a
charred
stable,
cloth.
relatively
This is how you
stable
make char cloth.
ecosystem
You
at any
put
given
cotton
point in time.
cloth
To shock it
into
with
a
something
tin
that
can
different for
and
fresh
poke a hole in
charcoal,
it and put that in
much
the
fresh
fire.
charcoal it
That's a
was,
retort.
would be a real
It's
shock
also
to
a
the
great way to
system.
make
It
art
would
pencils
sink.
from sticks.
So it's
A retort gives you maximum control over your product.
1%
It's a great way to
of
do
the
it, but
volume
it's
per
limited.
year.
It's a batch
What we can do
approach.
is then if you
There's some continuous approaches too, but there, as you can imagine, running a conveyor belt in a fire is
for a
difficult. But people
non-till
are doing
garden,
it.
one with worms,
And retorts are the most approachable. You
biology
can get
pull
55-gallon
worms
drums. You
of,
can build a fire under and seal them.
night
So
crawlers
it's a
in
great way to do
particular,
it. And you can run that wood smoke
like
underneath
organic
it.
material mulch that you
The
put
other
on the
way
surface and
is a
pull you into the
gasifier.
soil. And
Gasifiers
there's other
allow
forces too.
some
So
oxygen
when
into
I
the
am
fire.
working in a
And we have a lot of gasifiers around the United States. And in Montana, it's legal to have
right on the soil surface,
an external boiler where you fill it with, you use firewood type fuel, and you heat water, and you run it
because if
into
you
the
put it
house.
right on top, the air, if this
into the
material
building,
is so
and so
light
heat
that wind
the
and
building.
water.
We're not allowed to
erosion
do that
can
yet
take
in
to
Washington
the
State.
point
There's some
where
air quality
half of the charcoal
regulations that we
that
have
is produced
that you
in
don't have
nature
in Montana.
ends up in our sediments, ends up.
But
in
you
our
can run a
river belts,
gasifier
out
because
out to the
and
ocean.
save the charcoal. Because basically, it works on the principle of heat distillation of the wood gas off, and you can design these gasifiers and run these gasifiers in a way
The charcoal
that you can
itself
get a
does
charcoal
have
component that it would be much more difficult to get with
impact
a wood-fired
ash.
boiler
It's
that's
not
a
strong as the
traditional
ash,
combustion
and
approach.
we actually don't.
I really see the
science,
standalone
as I
gasifiers as
understand
being
it,
an
doesn't
important
know
component
what part of
for
the carbon
producing
structure
charcoal if people want
relates
do
to that alkalinity. But we
revitalize the
see it in
soils of
water
their community,
filtration,
their own
where
garden.
water moving through a large
So
quantity
things
of
like
charcoal,
technologies like that are going
you
to
get
advance.
an increase in the pH.
What do you do with the
that can
ash
only be
component?
explained
Though?
as
That's
charcoal
always a
effect.
question because it's
And that's
always there.
and
The ash component,
it's certainly the
mineral
direction to go
component.
for many soil.
The charcoal, of course, is pure carbon, but the ash is going to be calcium,
Any other
potassium.
questions?
It's going to be these minerals that are in the same
Good. Thank you
ratio
very
as the
much.
plant the plant material that you're burning. So in many ways, it's like the perfect balance of minerals to remineralize your soil. The issue with ash is that it's highly caustic. It's got a very high pH. when you run limestone into a lime kiln and have calcium oxides produced out of it. This is the same thing that happens with a wood fire. You're producing a high calcium material that's going to be a calcium oxide more than a calcium carbonate. It's going to have a pH of 12 or so. And if you use that immediately on your soil is going to suffer from the effects of that alkalinity, unless you're trying to turn an acidic soil around, then it would be a net positive. But generally around this part of the world, it's something that we use with caution. And I've had friends who make biochar, neglected this component, and have caused their soils to be too alkaline for their garden use. So this is definitely a concern. One of the nice things about calcium oxides, potassium oxides, is that is a short-lived effect, that causticity. Just like when you take concrete and when you work with it dry, you have to wear gloves because it's so caustic. But then when you pour the concrete, and after it's gotten wet and it's equilibrated with atmospheric carbon dioxide, it's a pH 8.4, and you don't need gloves to handle it, except that it might hurt you might open up your skin or something, but it's not a caustic issue. The same thing with the ash. If you run that ash through a compost pile, you're going to reduce the causticity. 8.4 is still a little higher than what you'd want for your garden, but it's way better than 12, and it's much easier. You can work with larger quantities and work with it as a more neutral component. But if you want to use ash as a lye, as a caustic, you want to make soap, you would definitely want to use the fresh ash for that. You would not want to use old ash to experiment with soap making. So the ash can be very much a net asset for soil. How to use the charcoal. Interestingly, charcoal has not been used for really helping soils out across the landscape. Like, we don't have large swatches of farmland using charcoal, but large amounts of charcoal do get used for other purposes that relate to how we live our daily lives. A major use of charcoal in the 1950s that I found a historic record of, and it's not just the 1950s, but that's the record I found, very important as a component of chicken feed. And the largest biochar sales that I'm aware of went to a poultry grower in North Carolina. And we're talking about multiple cubic yards of charcoal being sold for about $600 a cubic yard, and three truckloads of it. So we're talking a substantial economic benefit of using this that's recognized by certain industries. The chickens are healthier, and they produce better, and those all have economic value. So adding it to cattle feed, to various types of feed, is a legitimate way to use charcoal and pay for your effort in making it. We mentioned the art aspects, and we mentioned some of the health. You can eat charcoal if you have an upset stomach. You can brush your teeth with it. There's a lot of different ways to use charcoal. And certainly filtering water problems. Somebody called me from Standing Rock to ask, what should we do, Phil? We've got water quality issues. And I said, well, you've got campfires. You guys are burning a lot of fuel. You have a charcoal component. There are ways to clean up your water in ways that you can use charcoal. So charcoal's a handy thing to have around, handy thing to make. We use it in our soil, but I don't really see it as a replacement for compost or any other component that we're already using. Charcoal is a complement. It's something that you would add into the system. If you have compost for your garden, you would put charcoal into your garden, into your compost, and you would age it that way. It would fill with nutrients. Biology would start to populate it, and that would be much more beneficial for your garden than just putting raw charcoal right out of the fire into your garden. How does charcoal work? We've speculated many different ways for it to work. I mentioned the electrical conductivity aspect. That's been proven out by folks who remediate soils that are full of munitions. So you have high oxygen demand propellants, and those go very anaerobic, which slows down the remediation. Charcoal speeds it up. That's a great use. But the charcoal structure that's retained from the plant materials, you still have all that porosity and that porous structure, and to the point where charcoal has a lot of surface area. It's far larger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that gives a huge playing field for biology to work with. And biology is attracted to charcoal. You have charcoal in the soil, you will find fungal hyphae through it. You will find roots seeking out charcoal and going through the charcoal, and a large diversity of biology associated with the charcoal. So the charcoal becomes kind of a meeting place for the biological community. And as you think about how that would work, soils go through seasonal and weekly fluctuations in temperature and moisture. And so soil is always getting killed off by freezing, by drying, and the biology is crashing. And then it has to re-inoculate and repopulate the soil every spring. And how quickly that happens, it depends on quite a bit on how much inoculum, viable inoculum, there is in the soil. Just like it's how much yeast you use to make bread. You use a lot of yeast, it's going to happen faster. Biochar in the soil really helps the soil to spring back into life. I'm using the terms charcoal and biochar interchangeably, and I realize that terminology is a source of confusion for people. It is charcoal, and we say that it's charcoal made with the intent to be put into soil. But really, biochar is just an international marketing term that we agreed on. Before the term was biochar, it was agrichar. But then somebody in Australia trademarked that term, so we've moved on to biochar. I kind of like the agrichar better, but it's just a marketing term, and it really is just charcoal. I have high hopes that we can, as individual gardeners, learn how to make charcoal ourselves individually, because it is far too expensive to buy it at the store. If you're buying it at the store, please do it because you want to experiment with it. You want to see what good quality charcoal is that's made with this intent. But it's so easy to make charcoal that nobody should shy away from doing it, even though there's no real laws set up to be able to do this. In the city of Spokane, I've looked at my air quality laws. If I was to state that I am making charcoal, that would be illegal. That's not a recognized use for a home fire. I can use it for heating, I can use it for cooking, I can use it for drinking beer around, I can use it as part of an artistic build, but I can't say when the air quality folks come by, why are you having this fire? I can't say, well, I'm making charcoal for my own use. So our laws and our culture just has not really accepted the idea that having a fire for something that we would use in this way, they see it as disposal of your prunings or something like that. So we have a ways to go, but I would encourage everybody to explore this. And if you're going to make biochar, bring some marshmallows, bring beer, so that you have that can be your primary use, and biochar should be a secondary component of that. And I think that's really the superpower of biochar and of charcoal, is that we do things in this life where we have an opportunity to produce charcoal, and that's how we should be producing charcoal, not with the charcoal being the primary intent. There's a lot of businesses being built around producing biochar throughout the United States, and the biochar product is the primary driving economic factor, and these businesses are failing left and right. The venture capitalists are not making their money back, and this is because the quantities that we're talking about, the infrastructure, that you need to support that kind of business enterprise, the transportation involved. First, you have to generate enough quantity of biochar to make it worthwhile as a business. Then you have to transport it all over the place. You have to sell it. It's just not economically productive. That's not how they. That's not the approach that they used to fill the Amazon with charcoal. Certainly, that was something different than a centrally localized, centrally located charcoal production. Fire is in our blood. We're humans because of fire. Neanderthals and the pre-Homo sapiens that came before us, they had fire. They worked. They used fire to make their food more digestible, to make their food more valuable. And in that process, our bodies and our minds changed. Our intestines became shorter, our jaws became less powerful. We could support the larger brain that uses 10 to 20% of our metabolic energy because of fire. I mean, fire is who we are. So giving that fire responsibility to somebody else really doesn't make sense when we can see the opportunities in our daily lives for making charcoal and for making good quality charcoal. I think that exhausts what I can think of right now. If I had some questions.
Do you have any, you'll have to repeat this question too because I won't be able to hear it on there.
Yeah.
Do you have any processes to know how much charcoal to put on a garden?
The question is, what kind of guidelines do we have to know how much charcoal to put into a garden? I am a big believer in small increments every year rather than one large amount at a time. But if you were to do one large amount at a time, I certainly would not exceed 10% of the volume of the topsoil. And the reason for that is that a soil is a stable, relatively stable ecosystem at any given point in time. To shock it with something that different for fresh charcoal, that much fresh charcoal at once, would be a real shock to the system, and it would set back your soil. So it just makes far more sense to put in 1% of the volume per year over 10 years than to do 10% at once.
So if I'm doing a non-tilled garden, you just put it on there
For,
and let it leach through, or what?
Yeah, for a non-till garden, one with worms, one with enough biology to pull worms, earth, night crawlers in particular, work by pulling organic material, mulch that you put on the surface and pulling it into the soil. And there's other forces too. So when I am working in a no-till kind of a situation, I usually use a mulch on top of the charcoal and put the charcoal right on the soil surface along with some of the nutrients and some of the other things that you put under mulch to goose a garden. And because if you put it right on top, the air, material is so light that wind and water erosion tend to take it off, and to the point where half of the charcoal that is produced in nature ends up in our sediments, ends up in our river deltas and out into the oceans. So the lightness of it is a real consideration.
Can you touch again on what the effect it has on the pH?
The effect of charcoal on the pH. The charcoal itself does have an alkalinizing impact separate from the ash. It's not as strong as the ash, and we actually don't know, science, as I understand it, doesn't know what part of the carbon structure relates to that alkalinity, but we see it in water filtration, where water moving through a large quantity of charcoal, you get an increase in the pH that can only be explained as a charcoal effect.
That's good for us.
Yeah, and it's certainly the direction to go for many soil, for water health and health reasons. Any other questions? That's good. Thank you very much.